Well, let's get this show on the road. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ken Paulman. I'm the director of the Energy News Network based at Fresh Energy here in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I would like to welcome everybody to this panel discussion we've titled Beyond Representation, Equity in Climate and Energy Journalism. I want to acknowledge our partner organizations, well, you could call them partners, but Grist and the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition. The Energy News Network is a project of Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy's mission is to shape and drive bold policy solutions to achieve equitable carbon neutral economies. Together, we are working toward a vision of a just, prosperous, and resilient future, powered by a shared commitment to a carbon neutral economy. So for those of you just joining us, we do not have a chat feature active for this event, but we do have the Q&A feature. So if you look down at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A function. If you want to submit a question, feel free to do so there. We may not jump to those questions right away. We're going to kind of wait and see how they fit into the overall conversation. And with that, and also this event is being recorded. And if you need to jump off early or anything like that, a copy of the recording will be emailed to you after the event. So with that, I'd like to jump in and introduce our speakers. We have four fantastic panelists today. We have Audrey Henderson, who's a reporter for the Energy News Network, Rukiya Colvin, a freelance journalist and organizer, Marnese Jackson, co-director of the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, and Adam Mahoney, who is the environmental justice and investigations reporter at Grist. And I will do a quick round the panel here to give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. We do have an all Midwest panel, so if we get going too long talking about the weather, please feel free to jump in and interrupt. And I'll go left to right of my screen. We'll start with Adam if you want to go ahead first. Oh, and the question for the panelists is, after their intro, is what do you love most about what you do?
Hi, y'all. I'm Adam, and I use he, him pronouns. And I guess what I love about what I do is kind of interesting because I feel like I'm a walking paradox in a sense, that I love being a part of a community and I love being a part of change, but I'm naturally like an introverted person. So in a very odd way, my job allows me to do the things I love. I'm a part of a community and sometimes feel like I'm a part of, bringing change, but it also lets me communicate on my own terms. And allows me to listen and learn and strategically interject in a way that's like comfortable for me, and sometimes even more powerful in a sense. And then on another level, like being in the environmental space specifically has let me reconnect with my roots and my family and the community that raised me in a way that I had kind of lost for a bit. I'm originally from a frontline community in Southern California and have been living in the Midwest for 5 years now, but as a journalist, I'm able to now advocate for my past self and work to answer the questions I had as a younger person, as well as advocating for the people I love. So journalism really lets me like love out loud and on paper, which is like pretty fulfilling most of the time.
All right, thanks, Adam. Audrey, do you want to jump in next?
Hi, I am Audrey Henderson. I am right now in the very snowy suburbs of Chicago, but I'm originally from Tennessee. Both my parents are from the South. I'm one generation removed from the farm. What I really love about what I do is I'm like Adam, I'm an introvert. At the same time, I have insatiable curiosity. So as a journalist, I'm able to indulge my curiosity in a way that's constructive. And at the same time, while I'm digging into questions that really engage me, I'm able to get a message out to people who might not otherwise have access or even consider some of the things that I'm writing about or speaking about or communicating. So in a way, journalism for me is a means of satisfying my own curiosity and doing some constructive good for other people.
Great. Marnese?
Good afternoon. I'm Marnese Jackson, and I am from Pontiac, Michigan. That's a little bit outside of Detroit. And I actually was born in the South as well, in Mississippi. But what I really love about this work is that it helps me get connected to, of course, my people, Black, Indigenous people, and then also the fact that I like advocating for people who is burdened by energy burden, and I had that experience. However, I think with me being a connector and a relator, it helps me to show up in my authentic self. People think I'm an extrovert, but I'm actually an ambivert. So I'm half with you introverts. And so it helps me to relate when it's time to have those real conversations about the work that we're doing. So thank you, and it's nice to be here.
All right, Rukia.
Hey everyone, I'm Rukia. I use she, they pronouns. I'm from Detroit. Currently live here, been here my whole life. Love the city, though there have been many times I wanted to move away, but yeah, I'm still here, but it's cool. Like most of everyone else on the panel, I do have, well, actually like Marnese, I'm learning about myself that I'm more of an ambivert. I used to claim that I was an introvert until I started doing journalism, and I realized that I enjoy getting to know and talking to people. So what I enjoy most about this work, well, I consider myself curious by nature and just a lifelong learner. So I appreciate getting to talk to and learn from so many different people, whether on a grassroots level or in a more technical background, just to hear how they have approached the work, especially, or more specifically in this climate work, and whether it's through lived experience or whether it's like an attorney doing pro bono work on the behalf of community. It's always great to kind of learn from different perspectives, and in a way, like Adam said, to strategically interject. So I get to take my perspective and tie that into what other people are seeing and feeling and experiencing, and bring that into my journalism to display that curiosity, I guess, in the writing. So I enjoy doing that.
Great, thank you, everyone. And so we'll jump into our first question. Our questions start really, really broad, and I think we'll kind of narrow in as we go. The first question to throw out to the panel is, what does equity in news coverage look like to you? Does anybody want to jump on that one first, or I can pick somebody? Going once? Rukia.
I'll go ahead and jump in just to get out the way. But no, so equity for me, and I want to say, yes, it applies to climate, especially just because I feel like climate equity news is starting to become more of a wider thing, just because, you know, climate change is becoming more of an urgent matter. But I feel like it's important to address equity in journalism, just in general, in its approach, as it has, you know, affected Black and Brown communities forever. So I will use a quote that I recently found from Ida B. Wells, who I absolutely love. And this was in the context of her doing her campaign for anti-lynching, but I feel like it still applies to just how we approach journalism in general, and how it affects communities of color. So the quote is, "The pulpit and press of our country remain silent on these continued outrages, and the voice of my race thus tortured and outraged is stifled or ignored whenever it is lifted in America in a demand for justice." So when I think about equity in journalism, I just think about how it's important to weigh the voice of the community and those directly impacted and affected with just as much value as professionals in the writing. So that's how I define it.
Anybody else want to jump? Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree, and thankfully you brought up Miss Ida B, because one of the things that I think in this day and age, and when we're building equity in news, there's a new philosophy that I think is following in her footsteps of movement journalism, and centering, you know, the needs of the community directly affected by whatever injustice or situation you're writing about and covering. So really, to me, equity in news today looks like community partnership, if not ownership, which is increasingly hard to do today because of, the shuttering of local news and the propping up of, online monopolies in the journalism sphere. But, to partake in that kind of equitable journalistic philosophy, like, means building relationships with people, and being in a place where people feel comfortable, to share their stories with you, which I think is something that has the power to explode in the digital age. And we saw it over the last couple of years, more specifically with the protests of 2020 and what grew out of that in the journalism world.
And Marnese, were you?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think equity in journalism, equity as a whole is, the practice of just and fair inclusion into a society, and for people to participate and prosper in that society and to their full potential. So I think as a journalist or journalism, you have to have that co-relationship with each other. And that means building relationships, authentic relationships, not to just tell the story or to get the story, right? But it also includes analyzing your own or recognizing your own unconscious bias, right? Or recognizing that or analyzing your own values, your personal values. Because when we tell a story, sometimes our point of view or being so focused on being objective as possible, sometimes our unconscious bias kind of get into that story. So I would say equity in journalism would mean practicing the golden rule, right? Treat people how you want to be treated. And that's just like the moral code for pretty much everything, right? If you have one. But, if you have some type of religious or spiritual teaching, I wouldn't personally tell a story if I didn't want, would I want to be viewed in that light, right? So I would say, try to go beyond the constraints that you are beholden to if you're really about being true to the story. And of course, lift up those community voices because those stories are the truth. Okay.
Adam, I wanted to jump back to something you said about, so we're talking about building authentic relationships with sources. And Audrey, I want to have you jump in on this one too in a little bit. But Adam, you talked about how technology can help with that, and specifically referencing the things that have happened over the last year or so. I wonder if you could expand on that point a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, for so long, really, the quote unquote voice of the people was being spearheaded through a newspaper, individual sources like that. But over the last 2 years, I really feel like we've seen people take it into their own hands and telling their own stories and having access to do that through social media and in various forms, which can get a little tricky, right? When you're thinking of like traditional journalistic norms and fact checking and all of those kind of things. But I mean, at its core, letting people tell their own stories is, I mean, to me, it's an amazing thing, and it allows, less of a chance for things to be co-opted or to be turned on their heads if you're getting it directly from the source. And it doesn't make it any less, true or in any means,
Yeah, and Audrey, if you want to, I don't know if you want to build on that, but I'm also curious to hear from reporters about what that looks like on the ground in terms of what Marnese described as building those relationships for a journalist who's working a beat. What does that look like? How might it differ from sort of other ways that reporting is done?
Well, that has been, and everybody knows this, the last 2 years have been a challenge on that front because of the pandemic. But as far as reporting on the ground, what it looks like for me is actually, at the risk of sounding simplistic, being on the ground, being in the location where the news is located, talking to the people who are there. A lot of times I will go to meetings, I'll go to, I'll arrange to meet people in person. One of the recent stories that I'm working on now is someone who actually I was introduced to her by someone that I had worked with previously on another story, and she made the request, can you come down and meet with me in person? Okay. She wanted to get to know me face to face, and I think it makes a difference. I've noticed the stories that I've been able to report on the ground, go to the location, it really changes my perspective, and it really changes how I tell the story. And one of the comments that has been made to me that has really stayed with me for years was someone came to me at a community meeting on the south side of Chicago, where I don't live, so I don't pretend that I live there. But someone had seen me at several meetings and came up to me and said, you know, one of the things I really appreciate you is that you show up. And it really made an impression on me. I didn't think that was special, but apparently it doesn't always happen. So to me, again, reporting on the ground is essential when you can do it. And when you can't, what Adam was talking about with social media and Zoom and everything like that, that's one way of maintaining or even building connections when you can't actually be face to face.
Rukia, did you want to build on that? I know you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I can add to that. I definitely agree with both what Adam and Audrey has said. And for me, well, thankfully, as a part of the fellowship I did with Energy News Network in partnership with Planet Detroit and a few others, I had access to connection to many different groups through that opportunity, but also through my connections, whether it was with organizing or through my grad school program as an urban planner. I just developed a sense of knowing how to connect with different community groups and initiatives on a grassroots level. So it made it a little bit easier for me, even with, you know, everything being online because of the pandemic, you know, whether it's reaching out to someone and sending an email like, hey, you know, can I learn a little bit more, you know, about what it is that you're doing, or how can I follow what you're doing, you know, even after we talk for this interview, I still want to follow along, not necessarily to gain another story or, you know, another opportunity, but because I genuinely want to know what's going on in this area of the city. Like Detroit is it's a large city and it's hard to keep up with a lot of things, but just because I have family here, I have friends here, you know, I like to know what's going on. I genuinely like to stay connected for those reasons. But I mean, you can even do that even if you don't have those connections, right? It's as simple as reaching out and sending that email, or, you know, I know we can get fatigued or overwhelmed by so many emails, but just signing up for that newsletter or following on social media has helped me out a lot.
And so, Marnese, did you want to jump in?
I was just saying from an organizer standpoint, and I definitely agree with Audrey that showing up is key and consistency matters. So that will show that journalists, journalists that you're not trying to just get the story and print it, right? If you're showing up, building those authentic relationships, then you're also building trust. So I think going back to those organizing practices, that if I can offer that to journalists, use those and keep showing up and being consistent, then you will build trust and you will have your awesome story where people will, of course, lift up that news network and then come back and say, hey, we have some more awesome stories. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask about. So you're reading my mind.
Yeah.
Audrey.
Yes, let me confirm what Marnese says, because I've actually had that happen. I've actually had people contact me and say, hey, Audrey, we're doing such and such and so-and-so. And this is when we're doing it. And if I possibly can make it, I try to do that. So I absolutely agree with Marnese on that.
And Adam, I know we talked about this a little bit before, but you're covering the whole country, and what challenges do you face in your position? Obviously, you can't be in community meetings at 20 different cities at the same time. So how does that look in terms of the work that you do?
Yeah, so Grist is a national publication, and I do have 2 regional hubs that I cover, but I do end up covering the whole country a lot of the times. But one of the things that looks like then if I'm covering a place that I'm not necessarily familiar with or a part of the community or have those kind of relationships does end up mean you're falling on whatever voices are the loudest and have been in the sphere the longest, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can turn that way if one of the things that I've noticed with national publications is that you can run a story, 3 different national pubs will talk to the same people for their story, and that obviously means voices are missing, right? And people's lived experiences are not being represented fully, and sometimes even inaccurately when you do that. But I think one of the ways that Grist has got around that during the pandemic is they've been more inclined to commission freelancers and communities that are, so they'll commission freelancers or people who are part of the community to write stories instead of having someone in their home 1,000 miles away writing it, which is difficult. You can't always do that because of financial challenges, but that goes back to my point of with social media and people telling their own stories, there are ways to work around that from a national perspective, because people are on the ground, and a tweet can be a form of journalism. Sometimes they're telling the world what they're seeing in the moment. So that's a way that we've been able to get around that over the last couple of years.
And so we can probably build on that a little bit with our next kind of big picture question, which is what are some of the ways that news organizations have failed or are currently failing to achieve this? Anybody want to jump on that one? Don't worry about offending me, by the way, because I know where we failed.
I definitely like where Adam was going, that big news companies go to, or even small ones keep going to the same voices because they're the loudest. Doesn't mean that their story is the same as others. And then also if they have the facts, right? Some people get the story and it's off of emotion, right? Because something may have happened. And for speaking, environmental and climate justice impacts is definitely filled with a lot of emotional harm. However, I think and I feel that when you're reporting the news, it's definitely built off of people's emotions, right? You got to tailor it towards the emotions so people will watch and people, will be in an uproar. However, they miss the story about the solutions, right? That needs to be lifted up. Oh, I had a nice energy efficient home that was a demonstration project in this community, or there was a solar installation in this low income community, or they're doing something about Flint water crisis finally, right? So I feel that we need to focus. I think they missed the mark when you keep going to the same people. There's nothing wrong with that. However, we also need to move towards some solutions so people won't feel like, oh my goodness, there's never going to be any hope for this climate movement. I don't even know why we're focusing on that. Let's focus on all the other stuff. But then another piece to that, if you do focus on the same person and not something new, then you may miss an opportunity to lift up other environmental impacts, right? That we may miss. So that's what I think kind of missing the mark looks like.
What I was going, and I think Marnese is absolutely right. One of the things that I've noticed, and maybe this is just the way I look at things, is a lot of times people go into a story with their minds made up. This is what the story is, and this is what I'm going to report. And you can miss a lot when you do that. Some of the best stories I've ever done have been when I've gone in, yeah, I had, you know, an assignment or a perspective or something that I was looking for in particular, but listening to what people are saying, seeing what's going on, and letting the story tell you what the story is. Instead of you going in with, you're determined, you've got this tunnel vision, here's my story, this is what I'm going to report. You miss a lot. I think a lot of times news organizations really miss the story because they're trying to chase their story.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think a lot of that I feel like comes from just the nonprofit complex and the need to, I guess, meet the requirement of what's needed from a funder for stories, right? And like Marnese was saying, that's where you come from with missing the mark on solution-oriented stories from people who have been on the ground. And like I said earlier, who have been facing these environmental issues, you know, before climate change and climate justice has become sort of like buzzwords. So going off of what Audrey said, you miss the mark when you kind of like have that set goal and you set things in mind, because it completely undermines the people who have been on the ground working, creating these solutions out. And don't get me wrong, you know, we do need stories around like policy changes and things that are important, but you could be missing the key piece to really convincing policymakers of why this is important, because you're not highlighting smaller projects that are emphasizing why we need these policy changes or need that extra leverage to get these things going on a larger scale.
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly with my editor hat, but this takes time, doesn't it, to do this well?
Yeah. Well, this is what I was going to say is not really necessarily aligned with what anyone has said already, but one of the big things that I've been thinking about and the ways that news organizations have been failing historically is that news and information isn't a commodity, right? You know, it's bought and sold, and that means the people with the most social capital and financial means are the ones that are, you know, accessing information. And that's, before I was working at Grist, I was at a newspaper, and that's one of the things that, you know, I saw often is, you know, the communities that you are, you know, the most disadvantaged communities that you're writing about, they're not the ones accessing, they're not the ones paying for the newspaper, right, to read the story that you're writing. And it's really the same thing in the online world. You know, the people you're writing about aren't necessarily the ones that have time to spend hours on the internet reading things, because, you know, quite frankly, if you're writing about disadvantaged communities, they're typically poor, and being poor means you don't have free time to do those things, right? So, I mean, in turn, I think that means publications have shifted to focusing on, you know, think tanks in the government or different organizations that they focus on as their audience rather than the people you're writing about. So it really, you know, folks have to ask themselves why they're writing about X, Y, and Z, and who they're writing for, and who actually benefits from the craft, because rarely is it the community that you're writing about, sadly.
And I just want to add something quick to that, Adam. When you said that writing as a commodity, it made me think of a movie I was just watching on Netflix, Don't Look Up. I don't know if anyone here has seen that, but it makes me think about how the media is portrayed nowadays, and you're just thinking about ratings. And I know that was more on the scale of like the comet coming onto Earth and everything, but it's the same idea, right? We don't take these things serious until like it's right there in our face, even though, you know, people, or in this case, not necessarily movie, but like there has been outcry about these things for years now. But it's always been there. But because we're looking for more of the pleasantries or things that are gonna draw more of attention for the likeness of it, you kind of miss the mark on more important things.
I don't know if you noticed this, Ken, but we were all laughing when you were saying that news takes time. A lot of times that's the one thing that reporters don't have. We're not so much with nonprofit, but I used to work on a daily newspaper, and you went on your beat. You spent an hour or 2 hours talking to the cops or whoever. You came in, you wrote your story, and you had to, I mean, you had a news hole. And if you didn't write your copy, there was a hole on the front page of the paper. So I'm not sure how to resolve that or deal with that, but it is an issue.
Yeah, definitely. And to those watching, feel free to use the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen if you want to submit a question. We have a question from Linda, and this might be kind of delicate because I don't know if we want to get into the business of calling out any particular news organizations, but maybe we can approach this more broadly. Can you give specific examples of what we're talking about, specific examples of stories that are good and bad in coverage?
Start with one where I focused on what residents were doing on a ground level as it related to an ordinance that was created here in Detroit, the Community Benefits Ordinance, and how it's currently regulated. It doesn't actually benefit those who are in the impacted areas when they have to enter into community benefits agreements with developers. So in the case of a corporation who is expanding their developmental efforts in an area, but they've been imposing air pollution on the area since their plants have been there, but now they're expanding, and now you have more of these volatile organic compounds going into the air, and the community have been like really fighting against this for years now, and still fighting against it really, but the story was, it was more so geared around what the residents are doing to fight the city and that developer for better terms in the ordinance to better protect them rather than just accepting what they have because it's the ordinance. So I would say that's one example because it's highlighting, it's not a solution yet, but it's highlighting what's being done to find a better solution to the problem that's still at hand.
I have another example, maybe good and bad, depending on how you look at it, okay? I was thinking about a news story about a gas pipeline going through a community. And one part of the story was that it lifted up the environmental harm and that the community, half of the community was in uproar about it because of course, if the pipeline erupts, it's going to affect the water quality, right? The other part of the story that was quoted by someone who was the owner of the pipeline said that the community is in agreement with the pipeline because it's going to create more jobs. This was all in one news story. So I kind of felt like, yes, they're getting to the meat that this is an environmental impact, right? But then on the other end, which is also an advocacy issue that we run up against as activists, that's the job part, right? No one wants to be without employment, right? So this story tailored to people's emotions because don't no one want to be broke, right? So this is going to bring jobs at the expense of people's health. So I think it did a great job of lifting up the issue. However, I think it did a bad job with that part right there. Not to say we shouldn't lift it out because that's the elephant in the room. It's just hard, right? So for my journalists, like, how do you speak to that? Like, what's the right way to do that? And I'm sorry, I took over your job, sorry.
Yeah, nobody likes to be broke. I'm going to talk about a story that isn't on the surface doesn't seem to be much about energy, but it's a story I did a while ago on biking inequity. And basically, one major part of the story was disparity in ticketing in Black and Brown communities, and that being a disincentive for people to ride bicycles. Another part of it was the inequity of things like divvy stations or public bike docking stations. And that was a story where, you know, on the surface here in Chicago, it's a big biking community. There are bike paths all over the city, but there are fewer bike paths on the south and west side. People on the south and west side get more tickets. There is just less infrastructure in general. And the story that I was able to tell was to illustrate those inequities and how that really impacts adversely on biking as a means of low non-carbon based transportation. So, and that was a story where I actually received a comment from someone saying, we've never seen this reported this way before. And I hope that doesn't sound like bragging, but I really took that to mean that, okay, I've done my job. I've really, again, conveyed something that is important, but might have gone unnoticed or underreported.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, because I also wrote a story about disparities in biking tickets in Chicago, because we're both in Chicago. But for my example of, what a bad story is, and I've seen done often, and I've, even done it before myself. But if you get a study like that, that shows disparities or, whatever scientific studies, because so many climate and energy stories are based off of, research studies, is if you just spread out what's on the page and don't connect it to actual human stories, which I think is probably a bigger issue on a national level than from local publications. But, that just breaks the reality of what people are actually experiencing from, being able to advocate for them if you don't make those connections. And I think a lot of publications tend to do that when they get into, heavy science studies or research-based studies. So really, I think too often we fail as journalists. We think we're supposed to be informing people, but really we're supposed to be educating people and breaking it down in a way that's accessible for them, like Audrey did in her story.
Yeah, and to add what Adam just said about like having a technical heavy story, that's where I like to have a good balance of having that community voice and having that emotion in there to address those disparities, but also having a technical voice in there too to kind of lend that advice of what they're hearing from communities and how they've been finding solutions for it, and also applying some of that more quantitative data. It's okay to have that balance, I think.
Yeah, and I will go ahead and call ourselves out at ENN, because we have been guilty of all those things in the past. When we started, our reporters had a fairly high quota of stories to hit, and they were working mostly from remotely, which means you do tend to rely on people who are really easy to reach, who are going to be the first to pick up the phone, who are coming to you with stories. And so I think back to Linda's question, like, what's an example of stories that don't do this well? There's a lot of them, and they're not necessarily inaccurate, but they're not complete. And so I wanted to kind of come back to, because I think Rukia and Marnese both hit on this point too, which is where if we're sort of the disconnect between policy and who the policy impacts. And I wonder if either of you wanted to kind of build on that some more, maybe explain more what you mean by that.
I will start, and for me, like I don't have the scope, a bigger scope that you all have with my reporting. I've focused more on a local level, so I'll speak from the local perspective. It comes from having less of a democratic process, which also plays into journalism. Not giving them that voice. So I feel like when you have these local policies and even just the lack of access to get residents to give their feedback and weigh in on those things, it affects the policies, like a community benefits agreement, for example. Well, that's not a good example for Detroit, because they're a grassroots community is actually who brought the community benefits ordinance to the city council. So that was actually a great example of democracy. But just when it comes in terms of like creating or changing policies in the city, it can get a little murky in the waters when they get the community's feedback and things get set into stone. And that's when you have the community fighting back and wanting to get their stories out about what they're facing. So it's not as proactive, it's more reactive, which causes those issues. I feel like, I don't know if that answered the question.
No, oh, go ahead, Marnese.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
I'm not sure there was a question, but I was thinking back to the idea of that the process of setting policy and how it can be disconnected from the people that are actually supposed to benefit, and that's really broad. I don't have a complete thought on what a question will be that ties it into specifically news, but I just wondered if either of you wanted to expand on just that concept more broadly. And if not, we can move on. Okay, so I want to go back because there's a couple of things from some of our earlier discussions that we haven't had a chance to hit on, and one of them is problems versus solutions. And one of the comments that came up in one of our planning meetings was that part of what makes news coverage equitable or helpful is that it's pointing to sort of solutions and a way forward instead of just sort of restating the same problem over and over again. And again, I don't have a question. It's just more of it's more of a comment than a question because I'm a white guy. But if anyone wants to pick up that topic and expand on that idea from what you've seen or what you've written, go ahead, Marnese, you ready to jump in?
Well, I personally haven't written it, and of course I'm coming from like the organizer standpoint and how I see it from that end. I just think you have to, it's like a both. You have to do both. Of course, lift up the problem, right? But then also lift up the solutions, because that would bring more people into the movement to eliminate these climate impacts, these environmental impacts. So I think it's a both, a good balance, but then also it's the process to get back to maybe the policy question or getting people involved in the process is very key, especially when trying to advance any type of policy, so they can feel that they have buy-in and that the people that they elected didn't just put all this stuff together. And of course, everybody's not going to get everything they want. However, at least people are coming together to say, hey, I did have some buy-in, or I was at the table and I was a part of the decision-making process. There's no different when doing the news, getting people involved in the process and lifting up these stories and be, just like I said, being consistent as much as possible, especially in this day and age, working remotely in the pandemic and all these safety measures, and then everything else that's going on. If you're intentional about it, people will definitely will want to continue to look you up and be open to telling their story, right? So
what I wanted to add is what Marnese said. She said something that really resonated with me, is getting people involved with the process. I think a lot of times people read climate and energy stories, and I include myself in this, and you either get a sense of despair of, okay, there's nothing that can be done, or sometimes there's this silver bullet, let's do this and it'll solve everything. And you can't do that, because if people, you have to convey the issue realistically, but at the same time, you have to, as Marnese said, get people involved in the process and get people engaged in it and make it communicate that there is something that can be done, even if it's not going to have immediate results.
And to add, especially about the technical part, because climate and environment is very technical, you have to educate. within the process. So with your outreach plan, you have to have an education plan.
I want to add, I don't know if I have a direct answer, but something that I think about in my writing comes from like just my general disposition of curiosity, but I'm always wondering like, how do you engage the curiosity of readers when you think about the problem and solution? Like, we know that a lot of the problems come from decisions made by corporations and corresponding with policies created on whichever level of governments. But it's like, how do you educate people on that? And not necessarily persuade, but kind of build that curiosity in them to be like, well, how do we change this, since we see that this is the problem, and this is what these entities have done to these communities with these problems. But like, how do you get people involved in the sense of creating that curiosity for them to engage in some sort of action? I don't really know what that looks like as a concrete example, but that's just something that I try to think about in writing, which can be kind of hard at times.
Yeah, I also don't have an answer, and it's something that I struggle deeply with in this profession. I can give one example of last year. I wrote a couple of stories about a town in southern Illinois that has had basically broken infrastructure for over sewage infrastructure for over 30 years, and their streets have been, lined with poop, so to the point where people have bought boats to get through the water. And it's been written about hundreds of times over the last 30 years, right? So what comes from telling people about this problem? And I think it gets back to the point of like, who are you writing for? And Grist is like specifically solutions focused, but even so, if I'm writing a story, a solution-based story, solutions still have to be enacted, right? So I think that gets to this question really gets to the point of like the power of journalism, which, is tricky because it sometimes does not fulfill what you want it to fulfill. But it's something that I think all journalists should be grappling with within all of their work. That's the point of just why are you doing this, and who's actually benefiting from your craft?
That gets us to that big picture question that I think we talked about, which is, and I don't draw as clear a distinction between the two as other people in the field might, but is there a difference between journalism and activism? Are they the same thing? Is one a form of the other? Who wants to take that? Audrey?
I will say, yes, there is, with a caveat. And I will use an example. In the January 6th insurrection, there were people who stormed the Capitol, but there were also journalists who were there with them to create a visual record. That was journalism. And a lot of that visual record would not have existed had they not been there. And I consider myself to be on the journalism side in that I feel like I'm more effective when I'm writing about something and communicating about something. Not that I don't care about things, and that I don't, a lot of times I feel constricted in that I don't participate in protests or whatever, but I feel like I want to stay on that side of the line as a matter of my own credibility, so that I am seeing as much of the picture as possible, and that I'm conveying the story as clearly and as accurately as possible. And again, your mileage may vary, but that's where I stand on it.
And yeah, I would say that journalism is a form of activism. We think about journalism also as a form of communication, and activism is, well, the way I see it is truth telling, right? It's standing up for things that need to be said, to fight for justice, to fight for equity. to fight for the power of communities who have been underserved for so long. So I think, and this was said earlier, I think it's important to have that truth-telling aspect in journalism. And that's what it can get tricky for me, because I feel like sometimes more of my passion shows up in my writing, and it can feel a little contradicting when you're writing one thing and you can have an editor like, well, does this necessarily fit the frame of journalism? And I feel like it should, but that can be hard to struggle with. But I definitely feel like journalism is a form of activism, in a sense that it should be used for truth telling, which is becoming more prevalent now because we have so many things, and in this case, climate change, which is mostly written about in climate journalism. So,
Any other last thoughts on that, Adam?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I agree with both Audrey and Rukia, and I think if I was looking at it for myself, I would say no. But I think one of the things we have to always consider is that the people who like to make such a big distinction between the two are the people who claim to be objective and non-biased, which that does not exist either. So yeah, that's really all I have to add.
Yeah, I believe there's an active role for journalists in activism, to, of course, report out the stories and finding the truth of really what happened. And there is a role. However, sometimes if you're defining yourself as an activist, sometimes it can be seen as an unbiased opinion, or they have a biased opinion about whatever they're advocating for. So for example, what happened on January 6th, though what the insurrections, those individuals who did that may feel like they're activists, right? But then on the other end, as we're looking, we saw that as an insurrectionist, right? Not an activist, and not fighting for something of a good cause. So it just depends on where you see yourself at. So for me, seeing that was a form of not activism, right? You're taking over our country. However, someone who may feel that they were right may feel like they were activists. So it just depends on where you sit. So I think it just depends on the person and where they're at in this movement. But I just feel like, for example, in the climate movement, yes, there is a role to tell the story, to lift up what's going on, and to lift up the other stories that may have been missing.
I wanted to clarify and add to what Marnese is saying and what Rukia was saying. I think that there is a difference. I mean, the whole thing of people claiming objectivity, just the facts. Yeah, I'm not buying that so much. And people who know me know where I stand on a lot of things, and I'm not afraid to say that. So I'm not saying, when I say that I stand on the side of that there is a division or that there's a difference, I'm not saying that I'm one of these just the facts and no, people can't make, people have no bias. And I think you have to be transparent in where you're coming from. But at the same time, for me, I find that I do my best work if I allow the people who are involved in a situation to tell me what's going on, and I can see what's going on, and I can convey what's going on, rather than me try. I mean, if it's an issue where I have an active part, that's one thing. But if I'm going into a situation where I may have an opinion, but I don't have a lot of knowledge, I want the people who actually know what they're talking about to tell me what's going on. So that's what I mean by that.
Great. Well, we've got one more question for the panelists to wrap things up. But before we do that, just a few closing kind of housekeeping items. So again, this event is recorded. If you're registered, you will receive an email with that recording. Grist is a nonprofit news service. We're grateful to have Adam here. You should feel free, if you like and support his work, to support that organization and make a contribution there. And of course, the Energy News Network is also a nonprofit news service. And if you like and appreciate Audrey's work and what Rukia has also done for us, you can go to energynews.us and drop us a line, sign up to our newsletters, send a donation, news tips, recipes, book recommendations. We want it all. So the final question for the panelists, and we got about 30 seconds each to address this, is what is one thing you want the audience to do after watching this session? And let's go reverse from where we started. So Rukia, how about you go first?
All right, I would say, well, I don't know if everyone's here a writer or what your role is, but either way, I would challenge you to get to know a local organization, a grassroots level organization in your area. Just get acquainted with them, you know, find them on Facebook, find them on the internet, attend a meeting if you can, to, I don't know, just get to know them on a more personal level and see, if you're a writer, if that adds some compassion to what you already do.
Great, Marnese?
I totally agree with that. Please find a local organization, environmental climate justice organization, and learn about them. And then learn about individuals who are really out here doing the work. Big Greens, they do awesome work as well, but the real solutions are really coming from EJ and climate justice organizations. And that's where I stand with that. So please research these organizations. Thank you.
Audrey?
I would say, as a reporter or as a reader, if you're a reporter, take time to consider what your story is, who's telling it, who's not being consulted, who's not being heard. And if you're a reader and you're reading a story, take time to consider what's not being said. And if you have questions, that might be a clue as to a perspective that's not missing. And maybe you read from a number of sources to see if you can get different perspectives on the same issue.
Hey, Adam, last word to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Rukia, and I think if you do find a local organization that you want to be a part of, to constantly remember your positionality and try your hardest to decenter yourself. So, you know, that means centering those most in need.
Great. Well, thank you. I am very grateful to everyone in this group for taking the time to be on our panel today. Thank you to all of you who are watching, whether you're live or whether you're watching this recording sometime in the future. And also thanks, I neglected to mention Brianna Kerber, our communications guru here at Fresh Energy, who's been driving the bus for us this whole time, so I don't have to worry about it. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day. Bye all.